Welcome back to the flickering warmth of our campfire, friends. Tonight, we step away from the clashing of swords and the voyages of kings to enter a much more intimate yet equally dangerous battlefield. History often forgets the quiet courage of the women who ensured the survival of the human race in a world without modern medicine. Before we pull back the curtain on the mysteries of the medieval chamber, please take a moment to subscribe to Campfire Night Stories. A simple like on this video helps us keep these forgotten stories alive for everyone sitting around the fire tonight. Tonight, we follow a journey that was both a sacred blessing and a potential death sentence. In a time of herbs, prayers, and deep-rooted superstitions, how did a woman navigate the 9 months that would change her life forever? Tonight, we explore what being pregnant was really like in the Middle Ages. The spring air in the year 1324 was heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming hawthorn as Eleanor sat by the small stone window of her cottage. She placed a trembling hand over her stomach, feeling a faint, rhythmic tapping from within the movement the village called the quickening. In the Middle Ages, this was the moment a life truly began in the eyes of the law and the church, the moment the soul was believed to enter the body. But for Eleanor, it was also the beginning of a long shadow of anxiety that followed every woman of her time. She looked up as the heavy oak door creaked open, admitting Marjorie, the village midwife, whose apron smelled of dried rue and old wood smoke. Marjorie had seen hundreds of women through this journey, her hands calloused by work, but gentled by the wisdom of generations. "Eat your broth, child, and keep your mind away from the dark thoughts of the woods," Marjorie said, placing a bundle of herbs on the wooden table. Medieval pregnancy was a time governed by a complex web of do's and don'ts that would baffle a modern doctor. They believed that the mother's imagination was a powerful, physical force that could shape the child in the womb. If Eleanor looked at a hare, it was feared her child would have a split lip. If she saw a gargoyle on the church wall, the child might be born with a twisted face. "You must surround yourself with beauty," Marjorie advised, her voice a low, steady hum that calmed the girl's racing heart. "Look at the flowers, listen to the church bells, and keep a piece of red silk near your skin to ward off the evil eye of the envious." Food was another battlefield of superstition, where a woman's cravings were seen as the direct demands of the growing soul. If Eleanor craved salted fish, she was told she must eat it immediately, or the child would be born with scales. They believed the mother was a vessel that could be easily tipped, and her balance was the child's only protection. But beneath the talk of silk and flowers was the harsh reality of physical survival in a world of manual labour. Medieval women did not rest during pregnancy. Eleanor was expected to continue hauling water, kneading heavy dough, and working the garden. The community supported her, but the cycle of the farm did not stop for a swollen belly. "The work keeps the blood moving, but the spirit must remain still," Marjorie would say, watching Eleanor carefully for the telltale signs of the pale sickness. Pregnancy was a public affair, a shared concern of the village women who acted as a protective circle around the expectant mother. They whispered of the pains to come and shared remedies for the swollen ankles and the morning nausea that turned the world upside down. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the thatched roofs in shades of gold, Eleanor felt a strange mix of pride and terror. She was a link in a chain that stretched back to Eve, walking a path where the line between life and death was as thin as a piece of parchment. Part 2. The amulets and the prayers for protection. As Eleanor's belly grew, so did the number of protective charms that Marjorie insisted she carry or wear. In the 14th century, medicine and magic were not two different things. They were woven together like the threads of a tapestry. Marjorie brought a small, smooth stone with a natural hole through the centre, an adder stone, and tied it around Eleanor's waist. The stone has the power to pull the pain into the earth when the time comes, the midwife explained, with absolute certainty. They also used birthing girdles, long strips of parchment or silk inscribed with prayers to Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth. Eleanor would wrap the girdle around her waist, believing that the sacred words acted as a physical barrier against the demons of the air. The church provided the spiritual armour, but the village women provided the practical, if often bizarre, psychology. They believed that a woman's humours, the liquids inside her body, became hotter and more unstable during pregnancy. To cool Eleanor's blood, Marjorie would have her sit in a garden of mint and lavender, breathing in the scents to settle the fumes of the womb. But there was also the constant fear of the changeling, the belief that fairies might steal a healthy human child and replace it with a sickly spirit. To prevent this, Eleanor was told never to be left alone in the dark and to always keep a piece of iron near her bed. Every ache and every flutter was interpreted as a sign of the child's future character or the mother's spiritual standing. If the belly is high and pointed, a son will bring strength to the fields. The village elders would whisper at the well. If it is low and wide, a daughter will bring grace to the hearth. Eleanor listened to it all, her mind a whirlpool of folk wisdom and genuine fear of the breaking hour. She knew that many women in her village had gone to the green and never returned, their lives snuffed out by the fever or the blood loss. To prepare, she would go to the local priest and confess her sins twice as often, ensuring her soul was clean in case she met her end. Medieval pregnancy was a 9-month-long preparation for a potential sacrifice, a time of settling debts and making peace with the world. But it was also a time of intense female bonding, a secret world of women where men were rarely allowed to enter. They spoke of the mystery of the body in ways they never would in front of their husbands or the friars. Marjorie showed Eleanor how to brew a tea of raspberry leaves and motherwort, herbs that had been used since the time of the Romans. The earth knows our struggle, child, and she provides the tools if we are humble enough to ask. As the months passed and the harvest season arrived, Eleanor felt the weight of her burden growing heavier with every step. The world seemed larger, more dangerous, and yet more beautiful as she stood on the precipice of motherhood. Part 3. The closing of the chamber. As the autumn leaves began to turn to the colour of rusted iron, Eleanor's time drew near. In the Middle Ages, childbirth was not a clinical event. It was a transition into a female, only sanctuary known as lying in. Marjorie arrived at the cottage with a purposeful stride, carrying a bundle of fresh straw and jars of pungent ointments. The first step was the sealing of the room, a practice that would seem claustrophobic to a modern observer. Every window was covered with heavy blankets, and every crack in the door was stuffed with rags to prevent the evil air and the night chills from entering. They believed that the mother and the newborn were incredibly vulnerable to spiritual and physical pollutants. "The light must be dim, child," Marjorie whispered, lighting a single candle made of beeswax. "The soul of the babe is like a candle flame in a gale. We must give it a quiet place to catch its breath." For the next several days, Eleanor would remain in this darkened, warm space, surrounded only by her godsibs, her female friends and relatives. This is where the word gossip originated. It referred to the women who gathered to support a labouring mother. They brought with them ale, bread, and a shared history of survival, creating a cocoon of female solidarity. Men, including the husband, were strictly forbidden from entering this space. Childbirth was seen as a mystery of the blood that belonged solely to women, and a man's presence was thought to hinder the process or even bring a curse. Eleanor sat on the fresh straw, the air thick with the scent of dried herbs and the steam from a pot of boiling water. Marjorie began to prepare the caudle, a warm drink of sweetened ale, mixed with spices and egg yolks, designed to give Eleanor the strength of an ox. But beneath the comfort was a ritual of preparation for death. Eleanor had already given her best kilt to the church and settled her debts with the baker's wife. She held a small wooden cross in her hand, her thumb tracing the worn grain of the wood as the first real pains began to radiate through her spine. "The earth is opening, Eleanor," Marjorie said, her voice dropping into a rhythmic, almost hypnotic chant. "Do not fight the tide. The tide is what brings the ship to the shore." Part 4. The Hour of the Breaking. The labour lasted for 2 days and 2 nights, a period that felt like a single, endless cycle of fire and shadow. In the medieval world, there was no anaesthesia beyond the occasional sip of wine or a prayer for a miracle. Marjorie used sympathetic magic to help the labour progress, moving through the room and untying every knot she could find. She untied Eleanor's hair, loosened the drawstrings of her chemise, and even unlocked the chests in the corner of the room. "As the knot is loosened, so shall the womb be opened," the midwife chanted. This was a psychological tool, a way to help Eleanor let go of the tension that gripped her body. When the pain became a screaming roar, Marjorie applied a poultice of lily root and eagle stone to Eleanor's thighs. The eagle stone was a hollow pebble, with another stone loose inside it. It was believed to call out the child through the power of attraction. If the labour slowed dangerously, Marjorie would resort to more drastic measures. She might force Eleanor to swallow a mixture of powdered unicorn horn, lightly ground narwhal tusk, or lead her in a staggering walk around the room to use the weight of the child. There was a constant, low-level fear of the transverse birth, where the child was positioned incorrectly. Without the ability to perform a safe Caesarean section on a living mother, Marjorie's only tools were her hands and her prayers. "Push with the moon, Eleanor. Push with the rising of the sun," the women cried out in the darkness. The room was a chorus of encouragement, a wall of sound designed to drown out the mother's cries and keep the demons of despair at bay. They used a birthing stool, a low, crescent-shaped seat that allowed gravity to assist the mother while Marjorie knelt on the floor. It was a primitive but effective ergonomic design that had been used for thousands of years. As Eleanor reached the limit of her endurance, the women began to pray to St. Margaret, retelling the story of how she was swallowed by a dragon but emerged unharmed from its belly. This story was a metaphor for the child emerging from the mother, a spiritual anchor for a woman in the throes of agony. Finally, with a sound that was half sob and half shout, the child entered the world, slipping into Marjorie's waiting, calloused hands. The silence that followed was the most terrifying moment of all, until a thin, sharp cry broke the tension like a glass rod. "A daughter," Marjorie breathed, her face lit by the dying candle. "A daughter for the hearth and the heart." Part 5. The Salt and the Swaddling. The arrival of the child was only the beginning of a new set of rituals designed to ensure survival. Marjorie immediately rubbed the newborn's skin with salt and honey, a practice intended to firm the flesh and ward off skin rot. She then began the meticulous process of swaddling, wrapping the infant in long strips of linen until she looked like a tiny white mummy. Medieval people believed that a baby's limbs were soft and malleable, like warm wax, and, if they were not bound straight, the child would grow up crooked or deformed. The babe was wrapped so tightly she could not move a finger, a state that was believed to keep the child calm and prevent her from scratching her own eyes. Eleanor, exhausted and trembling, was finally allowed to drink a bowl of warm broth, but her journey was not yet over. She would remain in the darkened room for another 40 days, a period known as the churching. During this time, she was considered ritually unclean by the church, but in practice, it was a period of mandatory rest and recovery. She was not allowed to cook, clean, or work in the fields. Her only job was to heal and to feed the child. This was perhaps the only time in a peasant woman's life where she was truly cared for by the community. The women of the village brought her pies, fresh eggs, and news of the outside world, keeping her mind away from the postpartum shadows. But the danger of childbed fever, the invisible killer we now know as sepsis, hung over the cottage. Marjorie watched Eleanor's brow for the first sign of heat, and her breath for the scent of the sweet decay. They used lavender-infused water to wash the linens, and burned dried rosemary to cleanse the air of the humours of the birth. It was a war against bacteria, fought with the weapons of fragrance and faith. "You have survived the dragon's belly, child," Marjorie said, placing the swaddled babe in Eleanor's arms. "Now you must learn the art of the long watch." Eleanor looked down at the tiny, bound face of her daughter, feeling a love so fierce it made the previous 2 days of pain seem like a distant dream. She was a mother in the year 1324, and she had just won the greatest battle of her life. I understand. We are at approximately 14,000 characters. We will now explore the complexities of nursing, the social structures of motherhood, and the spiritual re-entry into society through the ritual of churching. This part will add another 10,000 characters, bringing our total closer to 24,000. Part 6. The White Blood and the Wet Nurse. In the quiet, dim warmth of the sealed chamber, Eleanor faced the next great challenge of medieval motherhood, the feeding of the soul. In the 14th century, breast milk was not seen merely as food. It was believed to be whitened blood, a miraculous transformation of the mother's very essence. "Your milk carries your character, Eleanor," Marjorie warned as she adjusted the woolen blankets around the mother's shoulders. "If you are angry, the milk will turn sour, and the babe will grow up to be a brawler. If you are fearful, she will be a coward. This belief placed a heavy psychological burden on medieval mothers who had to maintain a state of holy calm to ensure the quality of their milk. For the noble women in the great house on the hill, the solution was often to hire a wet nurse, a woman like Eleanor's neighbour, who had plenty of milk and a sturdy constitution. But for a peasant woman, the bond was direct and absolute. However, if Eleanor's milk failed to descend, Marjorie had a library of strange and pungent remedies at her disposal. She brewed a tea of fennel and mother of thyme, and encouraged Eleanor to eat large quantities of oatmeal and boiled fish. If the breasts became hard and painful, the milk fever, Marjorie would apply warm cabbage leaves or a poultice of honey and ground linseed. The earth provides for the mother, so the mother can provide for the child, the midwife would chant. They also watched the child's output with an almost religious intensity, believing that the colour of the babe's waist reflected the balance of her four humours. If the child was colicky, it was blamed on Eleanor eating windy foods like raw onions or heavy beans. There was a profound understanding that the mother and child remained a single biological unit long after the cord was cut. This connection was both a source of deep intimacy and a source of constant gnawing guilt if the child failed to thrive. Every cry was a riddle, and every sleepless night was a test of Eleanor's spiritual endurance in the face of the shadow spirits of the night. Part 7. The Shadows of the Cradle. As the weeks of the lying-in period dragged on, the initial joy was often replaced by the heavy head of exhaustion and isolation. The darkened room, once a sanctuary, could begin to feel like a prison. Eleanor sat in the flickering light, listening to the distant sounds of the village, the lowing of cattle, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, and felt a strange detachment from her old life. Marjorie recognised the signs of the cradle melancholy, what we would today call postpartum depression. The spirit is thin after the blood, letting of the birth, Marjorie said, handing Eleanor a cup of wine infused with borage, an herb known for bringing courage to the heart. In the Middle Ages, they believed that the vapours of the womb could rise to the brain, clouding the mother's reason and making her susceptible to the whispers of demons. To protect the child during these vulnerable weeks, the cradle was never left in a draught and was often protected by a holy circle of salt on the floor. The greatest fear was overlaying the accidental smothering of the child in the shared bed. Because of this, many village priests insisted that the babe sleep in a separate wooden cradle, though the cold of the winter often forced mothers to keep their infants close for warmth. Eleanor would spend her nights singing lullays, ancient, mournful songs that often told stories of the Christ child or the dangers of the forest. These songs were not just to soothe the baby, but to soothe the mother's own fractured nerves. The gossip circle of women remained her only link to the world, bringing not just food, but the essential social medicine of storytelling. They shared tales of women who had faced the same darkness and emerged into the light, reinforcing the idea that Eleanor's struggle was a sacred, shared burden. It was a primitive form of group therapy conducted over bowls of pottage and cups of small ale. "You are not alone in the dark, child," Marjorie whispered during a particularly long night. "Every mother who ever lived is standing behind you, holding a candle for your soul." Part 8. The Ritual of Churching. When the 40 days of isolation finally came to an end, Eleanor prepared for the ritual of churching, or the purification of the Blessed Virgin Mary. In the eyes of the medieval church, the process of birth was a bloody mystery that required a formal spiritual cleansing before the woman could rejoin the community. While modern eyes might see this as a form of shaming, for Eleanor it was a triumphant passing out ceremony. She dressed in her finest kilt and covered her head with a clean white veil, a symbol of her renewed purity. Accompanied by Marjorie and her circle of godsibs, she walked the path to the village church, carrying a lighted candle. She did not enter through the main door at first. She waited at the porch, the threshold between the worldly and the divine. The priest would come out to meet her, sprinkling her with holy water and reciting the psalm, "The sun shall not burn thee by day, nor the moon by night." He then led her into the church by the sleeve of her gown, symbolizing her readmission into the fold of the faithful. Eleanor knelt before the altar of St. Margaret, offering her candle and a small coin in thanksgiving for her life and the life of her daughter. This ritual served as a powerful psychological reset. It marked the official end of her role as a vulnerable vessel and her return to her role as a wife, a worker, and a member of the village. For the first time in months, she stepped out into the full light of the sun, feeling the wind on her face and the weight of the child in her arms. The village greeted her with a small feast, the churching ale, where the men were finally allowed to offer their congratulations. Eleanor felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had faced the dragon, she had survived the darkened chamber, and she had brought a new soul into the light. She was no longer the girl who sat by the window in the spring. She was a woman who had been through the fire and found her strength. As she walked back to her cottage, the child sleeping soundly against her chest, she realized that the mystery of the body was not just about pain and fear. It was about the incredible, unbreakable thread of life that women had been spinning since the dawn of time. I understand. We are at approximately 21,000 characters. We will now move into the final chapters of this journey. The high-stakes reality of the first year of life, the heartbreaking frequency of loss, and the final reflections on the immense strength of medieval women. This part will add the final 14,000 characters, bringing us to the 35,000 character target. Part 9. The First Year and the Dance with Death. The return to the fields did not mean the end of the struggle, for the first year of a child's life was the most precarious bridge to cross. Eleanor carried her daughter in a linen sling as she worked, the rhythm of her labour serving as a constant lullaby. But every cough, every flush of fever, and every night of restless crying was a reminder of how fragile this new life truly was. In the Middle Ages, nearly a quarter of all children did not survive their first winter, a statistic that Marjorie never let Eleanor forget. "The spirits of the air are greedy for the young child," Marjorie said, showing Eleanor how to make a teething ring of smooth wolf bone. "We must keep the child's blood moving, and her spirit anchored to the earth with the weight of our love." The psychology of medieval parenting was a strange mix of deep attachment and a necessary protective distance. They loved their children fiercely, but they lived with the constant knowledge that the angel of death was a frequent visitor to the cradle. If a child fell ill with the sweating sickness or the strangle, The remedies were often more terrifying than the disease itself. Marjorie would blow smoke from dried sage into the child's throat or wrap the babe's feet in the skin of a freshly killed pigeon to draw the heat downward. They believed that a child's soul was not yet fully tethered to the body, and it could be easily frightened away by loud noises or sudden shadows. Eleanor spent her nights whispering the names of the saints into her daughter's ear, a spiritual attempt to label the child as belonging to the world of the living. She watched as her neighbour, Sarah, lost her son to a sudden chill in the midwinter, the sound of the small wooden coffin being nailed shut echoing through the village. The grief was not a private affair. The whole village mourned, for every child was a piece of the community's future. But the mothers did not stop. They did not collapse into permanent despair. They picked up their hoes, they kneaded their bread, and they held their surviving children closer. This resilience was the true popular psychology of the Middle Ages, a stoicism born of necessity and a faith that saw death as merely a different kind of birth. Eleanor learned that to be a mother was to live with a heart that walked outside of her body, vulnerable to every wind and every predator. Part 10. The Wisdom of the Crone. As the year turned once more, and the first snows of the next winter began to fall, Eleanor sat again by her stone window. Her daughter was now crawling across the floor, her laughter a bright silver sound against the howling of the wind. Marjorie sat across from her, her aged hands finally resting for a moment in her lap. "You are a different woman now, Eleanor," the midwife said, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the hearth. "The girl who feared the quickening is gone, replaced by a woman who has looked into the eyes of the great mystery and did not blink." Eleanor realized that the nonsense of the amulets, the superstition of the birthing girdles, and the magic of the herbs were all secondary. The real power of medieval pregnancy was the circle of women, the godsibs, the gossips, and the midwives. They provided a psychological fortress that modern medicine, for all its brilliance, often struggles to replicate. They ensured that no woman faced the darkness alone, and that every life, however short, was greeted with a ritual of absolute significance. Marjorie explained that her job was not just to catch the babe, but to hold the mother's spirit while the body was broken open. "We are the keepers of the gate, child," Marjorie whispered. "We watch the coming and the going, and we ensure the path is kept clean." Eleanor looked at her daughter and felt a profound sense of gratitude for the calloused hands of the midwife and the smoky breath of the birthing chamber. She understood now that the hysteria and the wandering womb theories of the male scholars were just a way for men to explain a power they could never truly possess. The reality of being pregnant in the Middle Ages was not found in the Latin scrolls of the monks, but in the whispered conversations by the well and the shared labour of the lying in. It was a world of intense physical pain, balanced by intense spiritual communalism. Eleanor was now a part of that secret history, a guardian of the thread that connects every generation of humanity. She knew that she might face the birthing stool again, and the fear would return, but it would never again be the fear of the unknown. She had been through the fire, and she had found that she was made of iron. Part 11. The Legacy of the Medieval Mother. The fire has now burned down to a single pulsing coal in the centre of the dark forest. The story of Eleanor and Marjorie is the story of our own ancestors the women whose names have been lost to time, but whose courage is written in our very DNA. To be pregnant in the Middle Ages was to walk a tightrope between a miracle and a tragedy, supported only by the hands of other women and the prayers of a distant heaven. They managed the waste of the spirit, the fear of the body, and the uncertainty of the future with a grace that we can only hope to emulate. As we look back at the made-up nonsense of their medicine, let us not forget the very real wisdom of their solidarity. They knew that a mother is not just a biological vessel, but a spiritual warrior whose battlefield is the cradle and the hearth. Thank you for joining me tonight at Campfire Night Stories for this journey into the hidden chambers of the past. If this story of the quiet strength of medieval women has moved you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to our circle. Your support helps us keep the memory of these forgotten lives burning bright against the cold of the modern night. Sleep well, and may the protective spirits of the hearth watch over your home until the sun rises. The embers are fading. The chamber is quiet. The night is yours.